The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time that week. Standing at attention outside the Queen's private quarters had become second nature to him after 15 years of service with the Grenadier Guards. His black bearskin hat sat perfectly balanced on his head, and his rifle remained motionless at his side. To the thousands of tourists who passed by daily, James was nothing more than a living statue, a symbol of British tradition, frozen in time. But on this particular Tuesday in September, something felt different. The air carried an unusual tension that James couldn't quite place. Queen Elizabeth II had returned from her summer holiday at Balmoral just 3 days earlier, and the castle buzzed with more activity than usual. Staff members hurried through the corridors with urgent whispers, and even the royal corgis seemed more restless than normal. James had been chosen for this prestigious posting not just for his military record, but for his ability to remain completely still for hours on end. The training was rigorous and unforgiving. Guards learned to ignore everything around them. Screaming children, flash photography, tourists trying to make them laugh, even physical discomfort. They were taught that nothing, absolutely nothing, should make them break character while on duty. Standing beside him was Corporal Sarah Williams, one of the first female guards to be assigned to the Queen's personal protection detail. She had faced twice the scrutiny and pressure to prove herself worthy of the position. Her composure was legendary among the guards, having once stood motionless for 6 hours straight during a state dinner while battling a severe case of food poisoning. If anyone understood the importance of maintaining protocol, it was Sarah. The two guards had been on duty since dawn, watching the early morning staff prepare for what they assumed would be another routine day. The Queen's schedule was typically precise: breakfast at 8, correspondence review at 9, and meetings with palace officials throughout the morning. Everything followed a pattern that had been established over decades of royal routine. As the clock tower chimed 9 o'clock, the familiar sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Both guards recognized the pattern immediately: the Queen's measured pace, accompanied by the soft clicking of her corgi's nails on the marble floor. This was normal. What happened next was anything but. The heavy wooden door beside them opened with its usual creak, but instead of the Queen emerging for her morning walk as expected, they heard something that made both guards' hearts skip a beat. It was a sound they had never heard before in all their years of service. Queen Elizabeth II was humming. Not just any tune, but Dancing Queen by ABBA, and she was humming it with genuine enthusiasm. James felt his left eye twitch involuntarily. In all his years of royal service, he had never heard the Queen express such casual joy. The most emotion he had witnessed was a slight smile during official ceremonies. This was completely unprecedented, and it took every ounce of his training to keep his expression neutral. Sarah, meanwhile, was fighting an internal battle. The sound was so unexpected, so human, that it created a crack in the formal barrier that had always existed between the guards and the monarch they protected. For just a moment, the Queen wasn't an untouchable figure of state authority. She was simply a grandmother enjoying a catchy pop song. The humming grew louder as the Queen approached the doorway. James and Sarah remained perfectly still, but their minds raced. They had been trained for terrorist attacks, medical emergencies, and diplomatic incidents. Nobody had prepared them for the Queen casually humming ABBA while walking her dogs. As the door fully opened, Queen Elizabeth stepped into view, and what the guards saw next would test their professional composure to its absolute limit. The Queen was wearing her usual morning attire, a sensible skirt suit and pearls, but her hair was slightly disheveled, as if she had been moving to the rhythm of the song. More shocking still, she was wearing what appeared to be bright pink fuzzy slippers instead of her typical sensible shoes. The corgis trotted alongside her, their tails wagging in what seemed like perfect time to her humming. It was as if the entire scene had been choreographed as the most surreal musical number in royal history. James felt sweat beginning to form under his bearskin hat, despite the cool September morning. The Queen paused directly in front of them, still humming, and bent down to adjust one of her pink slippers. As she straightened up, she glanced directly at James, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. In that instant, something passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared humanity that transcended all the protocols and traditions that usually kept them in separate worlds. What happened next would be talked about in hushed tones among the palace staff for years to come. The Queen, still looking directly at James, gave him the slightest wink and whispered, "Lovely morning for dancing. Wouldn't you say, Sergeant?" James felt his world tilt on its axis. The Queen had not only acknowledged his existence beyond his role as a human decoration, but she had made what could only be described as a joke. His training screamed at him to remain silent and motionless, but his human instincts fought back with equal force. The moment stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Sarah, watching from the corner of her eye, could see James struggling with the most difficult decision of his military career. The Queen continued to look at him expectantly, her eyes twinkling with mischief that seemed completely at odds with her usually serious public demeanor. The palace walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see if 15 years of rigid military discipline could withstand the unexpected charm offensive of a monarch in pink fuzzy slippers humming pop music. Everything James had been taught about duty, protocol, and proper behavior hung in the balance as he stood frozen between his training and his humanity. This was the moment when the carefully constructed world of royal protocol would either hold firm or crumble completely. All because of a simple question about dancing on a Tuesday morning in September. James felt his resolve cracking like ice under pressure. The Queen's question hung in the air between them, and her expectant expression made it clear she was waiting for some kind of response. 15 years of military conditioning battled against basic human courtesy, and for the first time in his career, James wasn't sure which would win. He started, then caught himself. Speaking while on guard duty was strictly forbidden except in cases of immediate danger to the royal family. But was ignoring a direct question from the Queen herself not also a breach of protocol? The contradiction left him paralyzed. Sarah, sensing her colleague's distress, made a decision that would change both of their careers forever. She turned her head, just slightly, barely noticeable to anyone else, and gave James the smallest, encouraging nod. It was a tiny gesture, but it communicated volumes. They were in this together. The Queen noticed Sarah's movement and smiled wider. "Oh, you're both music lovers, I see. How delightful." She clasped her hands together with genuine pleasure. "You know, I heard that song on the wireless this morning and simply couldn't get it out of my head. Quite catchy, isn't it?" The surreal nature of the conversation was overwhelming. Here was the most formal person in Britain discussing pop music while wearing fuzzy slippers and asking guards to break the most fundamental rule of their duty. It was like discovering that Big Ben could suddenly start playing jazz music instead of its traditional chimes. James opened his mouth again, this time managing to whisper, "Yes, Your Majesty. Very catchy indeed." The words were barely audible, but they represented the first crack in a dam that was about to burst. The Queen's face lit up with delight at his response. "Wonderful. I knew you both seemed like sensible people with good taste in music." What followed was perhaps the most bizarre conversation in the history of the British monarchy. The Queen, seemingly oblivious to the chaos she was causing in the minds of her guards, began sharing her thoughts on various ABBA songs. She mentioned that Mamma Mia reminded her of her mother, and that Fernando was particularly popular during state dinners because it was easy for foreign dignitaries to hum along. Sarah found herself nodding along, completely forgetting her training as she became genuinely interested in the Queen's musical preferences. The woman she had always seen as an untouchable figure of authority was revealing herself to be surprisingly knowledgeable about pop culture and possessed of a mischievous sense of humor. "You know," the Queen continued, her voice taking on a conspiratorial tone, "I've always wondered what you two think about while standing here for hours. It must be terribly boring." This question hit both guards like a thunderbolt. They had spent years perfecting the art of mental emptiness while on duty, training their minds to focus on nothing but their immediate responsibilities. But the truth was far more human and complicated. James had developed an elaborate system of mental games to pass the time. He would count tourists, categorize them by nationality based on their clothing and behavior, and create detailed backstories for interesting visitors. He had mentally redecorated the castle corridors hundreds of times and composed letters to his family that he would never send. Sarah's mental exercises were more practical. She used her hours of stillness to plan her personal finances, design renovation projects for her small flat, and practice foreign languages she was learning in her spare time. She had mentally conjugated more French verbs while on guard duty than most people learned in formal classes. The Queen's question forced them to confront the reality that their minds had never been as empty or disciplined as their training demanded. They were human beings with active imaginations, not the emotionless robots their roles required them to appear to be. "I think about music sometimes, Your Majesty," Sarah found herself admitting, "and about the people who visit. They seem so excited to be here." The Queen nodded approvingly. "Music is wonderful for passing time, and people watching is one of my favorite activities. You see such interesting characters, don't you?" The conversation continued for several more minutes, with both guards gradually relaxing into what felt like a normal chat between friends rather than a formal royal encounter. The Queen asked about their families, their hobbies, and their opinions on various aspects of palace life. She was genuinely interested in their responses and shared her own experiences with surprising openness. It was during this exchange that the first real crisis occurred. As the Queen was describing her own people-watching observations from palace windows, one of her corgis decided to investigate James's rifle. The small dog began sniffing around the weapon with typical canine curiosity, eventually lifting its leg in a way that threatened to create a very undignified situation. James's training kicked in automatically. He couldn't move to shoo the dog away without breaking position, but he also couldn't allow a royal corgi to urinate on his rifle in front of the Queen. The internal conflict was agonizing. The Queen noticed the situation and burst into laughter, not the polite, restrained chuckle expected from royal engagements, but genuine, delighted laughter that echoed off the stone walls. "Oh, Whiskey, you naughty boy, leave the nice soldier's gun alone." Without thinking, James gently moved his rifle away from the curious dog, a movement that technically constituted abandoning his post. Sarah, seeing the situation, also shifted slightly to help guide the corgi away from the weapon. In that moment, both guards had chosen humanity over protocol. The Queen's laughter grew stronger. "My goodness, you two are wonderfully practical. Much more sensible than some of the stuffy officials I deal with who would have stood there and let poor Whiskey create a diplomatic incident." Her approval of their rule-breaking was both thrilling and terrifying. They had violated their most basic duties, but they had done so to help her manage an awkward situation with her pet. The contradiction left them both feeling dizzy with confusion and relief. As if sensing that she had already pushed the boundaries quite far enough, the Queen began to compose herself. Her expression gradually returned to its more familiar formal setting, though her eyes retained a warmth that hadn't been there before their conversation began. "Well, I suppose I should continue with my morning walk," she said, her tone becoming slightly more official. "Thank you for the lovely chat. It's been most enlightening." She began to move away, then paused and turned back to them. "Oh, and don't worry about reporting this conversation. I'll handle any necessary explanations with your superiors." As she walked away with her corgis, still humming Dancing Queen under her breath, both guards remained frozen in place. But everything had changed. The invisible wall that had separated them from the person they were sworn to protect had been completely demolished, and there was no going back to the way things were before. The implications of what had just happened began to sink in as the sound of the Queen's humming faded down the corridor. They had broken character, violated protocol, and engaged in unauthorized conversation with the monarch herself. By every measure of their training, they had failed catastrophically. But somehow, neither of them felt like failures. For the first time in their careers, they felt like they had actually connected with the person they had sworn to serve and protect. The experience was both exhilarating and terrifying, and they knew that the consequences, whatever they might be, were only just beginning. The rest of that Tuesday passed in a blur of anxiety and confusion for both James and Sarah. They completed their remaining hours of guard duty in perfect silence, but the weight of what had happened hung between them like a thick fog. Every approaching footstep made them tense, expecting their commanding officer to appear and escort them away for disciplinary action. When their shift finally ended at 6 o'clock, they walked to the guard quarters without speaking. The familiar routine of removing their ceremonial uniforms and storing their weapons felt different now, like they were putting away costumes from a play that had suddenly turned into reality. Other guards chatted around them about mundane topics, weekend plans, football scores, complaints about the weather. But James and Sarah felt disconnected from the normal world their colleagues inhabited. It wasn't until they reached the parking area that James finally broke the silence. "Did that actually happen? Or have I lost my mind completely?" Sarah looked at him for a long moment before responding. "If you've lost your mind, then I've lost mine too. That was definitely real." They stood beside their cars, both reluctant to leave and return to their normal lives after such an extraordinary experience. The evening air was cool and crisp, and the castle looked exactly as it had that morning, but everything felt fundamentally different. "What do you think will happen to us?" Sarah asked, voicing the question that had been haunting both of them all day. James shook his head slowly. "I honestly don't know. We broke protocol in about 15 different ways. By the book, we should probably be transferred out of royal protection entirely." The thought was sobering. Both of them had worked their entire careers to reach their current positions. Guard duty at the palace was considered the pinnacle of military service, and losing it would mean starting over in less prestigious assignments. But somehow neither of them regretted what had happened. The next morning brought unexpected developments. When James and Sarah reported for duty, they were immediately summoned to the office of Colonel Hartwell, the commanding officer of the Queen's Guard. Both expected the worst as they stood at attention before his desk, waiting for the disciplinary action that seemed inevitable. Colonel Hartwell was a stern man in his 60s who had served the royal family for over 30 years. His office was decorated with photographs of various ceremonial events and commendations from decades of flawless service. He was exactly the type of person who would have zero tolerance for protocol violations. "Sergeant Mitchell, Corporal Williams," he began, his tone unreadable. "I understand you had an interesting conversation with Her Majesty yesterday morning." Both guards remained silent, unsure whether confirming or denying the incident would be worse for their careers. The colonel continued. "I received a very unusual phone call from the Queen's private secretary about an hour ago. It seems Her Majesty was quite impressed with your practical approach to unexpected situations and your refreshing humanity in the face of protocol challenges." James and Sarah exchanged quick glances, completely confused by this development. They had expected criticism, not praise. "Furthermore," Colonel Hartwell said, leaning back in his chair, Her Majesty has specifically requested that you both continue in your current assignments. She apparently finds your company more interesting than she initially expected. The relief was overwhelming, but it was mixed with confusion. How had their massive protocol violation turned into a royal endorsement? Colonel Hartwell seemed to sense their bewilderment and allowed himself a small smile. The truth is, he explained, Her Majesty has been discussing changes to guard protocols for several months. She feels that the current system is too rigid and creates unnecessary barriers between the security staff and the people we're meant to protect. Your conversation yesterday apparently convinced her that a more human approach might be beneficial. Over the following weeks, subtle changes began to appear in the daily routine of the palace guards. While they were still expected to maintain professional composure and remain vigilant, the absolute requirement for statue-like immobility was relaxed slightly. Guards were permitted to acknowledge the Queen with brief verbal responses when directly addressed, and small interactions were no longer considered career-ending violations. James and Sarah found themselves at the center of these changes. The Queen began stopping to chat with them regularly during her morning walks, asking about their families, their thoughts on current events, and their observations about palace life. These conversations were brief and professional, but they created a more relaxed atmosphere that gradually spread to other areas of palace protocol. The other guards initially reacted with a mixture of jealousy and skepticism. Some felt that James and Sarah had been unfairly rewarded for breaking rules that others had followed faithfully for years. Others worried that the changes would lead to a breakdown in the discipline and professionalism that had defined royal security for generations. But as the weeks turned into months, most of the staff began to appreciate the new approach. The Queen seemed more relaxed and approachable, which actually made their jobs easier rather than more difficult. Visitors to the palace commented on the improved atmosphere, and even the media noted that the royal household appeared more modern and accessible while still maintaining appropriate dignity. The most significant change came 6 months later when the Queen instituted what became known as humanity protocols. These new guidelines explicitly stated that guards and staff members were expected to prioritize the safety and comfort of the royal family over rigid adherence to traditional formalities. If a situation required flexible thinking or compassionate response, staff were encouraged to act appropriately rather than stick blindly to established procedures. James and Sarah were promoted to training positions where they helped develop new programs that balanced traditional discipline with practical humanity. They taught incoming guards how to maintain professional standards while still being able to respond naturally to unexpected situations. The training emphasized that protecting the royal family meant protecting their dignity and comfort, not just their physical safety. The story of their conversation with the Queen became something of a legend among palace staff, though the details were carefully guarded from public knowledge. It represented a moment when the institution of the monarchy had chosen to evolve rather than remain frozen in tradition, and it had happened because 2 guards chose to be human rather than robotic. Years later, when James and Sarah had both retired from active duty, they would occasionally meet for coffee and discuss that morning in September when everything changed. They never regretted their decision to respond to the Queen's unexpected friendliness, even though it had initially seemed like career suicide. The Queen, for her part, continued to hum ABBA songs during her morning walks, though she never again wore the pink fuzzy slippers that had started it all. She had made her point about the importance of maintaining humanity within formal institutions, and the changes she implemented based on that conversation continued to influence palace protocol long after that memorable Tuesday morning. The incident proved that even the most traditional and formal institutions could adapt and improve when individuals had the courage to choose compassion over convention. It showed that sometimes the most important moments in history begin not with grand gestures or formal declarations, but with a simple question about whether it's a lovely morning for dancing. The legacy of that conversation lived on in the slightly warmer smiles of palace guards, the more relaxed atmosphere of royal events, and the knowledge that sometimes breaking character was exactly the right thing to do. It reminded everyone involved that behind all the pageantry and protocol, the monarchy was ultimately about real people serving other real people, and that humanity should never be sacrificed for the sake of appearances. In the end, what truly happened when royal guards broke character in front of the Queen was that everyone involved remembered they were human beings first and everything else second. And that simple recognition made the entire institution stronger, more relevant, and more worthy of the respect it had always sought to command.